Bonjour à tout le monde. Bonjour à tout le monde. Good morning to all. So, welcome to those that came in Paris, and welcome for those that are in distance, at distance. So, we are going to spend 1 day and a half together to discuss how social sciences can help in the construction of public policy. So, this symposium is co-hosted by the program Growing and Protecting Crop Differently and the research project FAST. I'm going to give first some practical informations in order to be sure that everything will go well. So this is mainly for people that are not in the room, but that are at home in front of their computer. Be careful that you have to register for each session. So I guess that if you hear me, it is because you are in front of your computer. So you register for this morning, but you have also to register for this afternoon and for today morning. We will have time for questions after each speech. So we will try to organize smoothly questions for people that are here and people that are not here. So in the room, it's quite simple. You raise your hand, you take the microphone and ask your questions. And for the people that are in front on your computer, you should find on the Livestorm platform a space where there is questions. So there is like a chat, but it is questions. So you can write your question. So what I ask is that you put your question, you write your questions. You can also vote for question if you see that there is some interesting question that someone raised and you agree with that it is a relevant question, you can vote for it. And then we will summarize. We will summarize the question and ask the speaker to answer, and after that each speech. So don't hesitate to use this facility. So now, what I'm going to tell you as for an introduction, I'm going to explain a little bit in which context, why you are here. So what is this program that invite you, and what are the social sciences in this program. I know that most of you are very familiar with this background, but for those who are not, I will give some elements to introduce it. So it is a program that aims to support research, to produce knowledge for making possible the transition towards a pesticide-free agriculture. So that's a national French program. Why, and where does it come from? So as you know, the pesticide policy have been introduced in Europe and in France, more or less in the same period, more than 10 years ago, with no clear results, especially if we look at the trend in pesticide sales and use. In France, we have the French Plan Ecophyto that set targets of minus 50% in 2018 and 8, sorry. So that means more than 10 years, 13 years now, and we didn't achieve this target. We have now a new plan, Ecophyto 2+, with more or less same target for 2025. And you are also, I'm sure, very familiar what's going on at the EU level with the Green Deal and the Farm to Fork plan that also set very ambitious target with minus 50% by 2013. So it is the context. It is this context that we had this discrepancy between the target set by the policy and the results that push the French government to decide to enhance the research effort to find an alternative solution for pesticide. So this program was launched in 2019 with 30 million euros. We launched a call for ambitious research project that lasts for 6 years. And okay, it has been launched by the French National Research Agency, and INRAE is monitoring and the scientific part of the program. The objective clearly was to push the reduction in pesticides, but what was decided by the group at INRAE that proposed this new program is that in order to be efficient in terms of strong reduction, we need to fix a real more ambitious goal, which is zero pesticide. So the question is why it is like this. In fact, because what we observe is that we have a lot of research projects going on at the EU level that are trying to develop research to reduce pesticides. And our idea is clearly that if we remain in a framework where pesticides are still a solution, it's difficult really to initiate a paradigm shift that is essential for really the emergence of radical innovation. That's clearly the idea. And we have some a lot of examples in the different research topics that we can observe. For instance, if you consider that you need a real redesign of cropping system for going to minus 50%, you will need to push agronomists or geneticians really to go in other ways than normal one. On all these topics, so you have some example here. I'm not going to read all the list, but you can read it to have some illustration. We have that open really new science fronts in different topics, such as microbiota, chemical ecology, digital science. That was the idea. That was the basic idea, that we have to push research into really disruptive front sciences, and that was the idea for this program. So that was one originality of the program. That is one originality program. I would say that the other one is that what we are going today is we decided that in this program, in order really to maximize the impact, we need to develop activity such as conference, foresight study. That's one of the responsible of the foresight studies in the room here, so you can have discussion with him. And what we have also is a kind of methodology to follow the impact of the program. That's kind of quite original. It is very similar, finally, we realize that it is very similar. What we now, you know that at the EU level is called mission-oriented program. I think it's very interesting to make the parallel with the mission-oriented program, especially because if you write Mazzucato report, you understand and you can think about what are the specificity. What does that mean in terms of governance of a funding, of a research funding program? It means something different in terms of governance compared to what we know. We all know in our agricultural organization what is applied research, what is targeted research, and now it is a step further. A step further in terms that it is really future-oriented. It is really devoted to transformative research, multidisciplinarity, of course, involving stakeholders and reflexes. And that means that there are some consequences in terms of governance and management of the program, such as anticipation, impact assessment, that we have to have in mind if we want really to achieve the goal. The other question regarding those type of programs that we have discussed a lot when designing our own program is the issue of fundamental or applied research. We clearly consider that we need both we need fundamental and applied research. And in her report, Michel Mezzucato said we should have a conversation between the two. We should implement conversation between fundamental and applied research, and I think also it's a good point. In fact, what we need is big science deployed to meet big problems. So let me tell you just some word of why we are here today. So what is finally what I can tell you about the place of the social sciences in all this? The first place that is very well known, and it is very also quite explained deeply in this mission-oriented report, it is that we need social sciences inside the multidisciplinary project. Okay, we do agree with that. We do agree that in transformative research programs, social sciences are needed to help other scientists to better understand the context in which their innovation will be deployed and identify the levers enabling the development. They need to be there in the other project. And this is the case in this program also. For instance, there is projects that are studying how to increase diversification at the field or farm level. And we know that we need to transform the whole downstream value chain. So we need a kind of analysis also involving social studies. Okay, I see the time is going, so I'm not going to explain this in detail. I think you can understand that a lot of topics that are investigated by microbiologists that can find a new biocontrol solution will produce issues requiring social scientist investigation. For instance, really the biocontrol chain are very different to the one to sell pesticide, for instance. So those are examples. But, and that's the point I would like to stress, it is not, to my opinion, the enough. I mean, social sciences are also directly requested to help to design policy. Because it is policies, because the topics more or less is to design public policy. Maybe it doesn't mean that much things for social scientists to be in a zero pesticide program, because a lot of you are working on reduction of pesticide, because it's normal for social scientists to work on the real life. So it's also important but it is useful to have a kind of ambitious goal in order to push also this research. So the 3 points that for me make more or less kind of specificity of the need for social science in this program is a major research effort is needed. Because biologists or agronomists can design the point B, what could be a zero pesticide agriculture, but we are on point A, and so we need to study the way to go from point A to point B. That means to study the conditions for the transition. That's the first point. The second one is there is a lot of diversity of approaches among social sciences, in terms of concept or of methodology, but more or less they often do separately. So I think there is a real need to combine disciplines. It's very clear, and we will have example also between economy, psychology, and sociology. If we want to understand the behavior of farmers, for instance, we have a lot of advances that came from this combination. It's also very, very clear in other topics. And last point, we know that like like as in other disciplines, the major scientific advances come from new concepts and methodologies. So we need to exchange about disciplines, about methodology, and this is clearly something that could be done inside the social sciences. So I will finish my speech just by saying that it means that there is a lot of things to do in order to design this transition path and these new policies. There is a lot of things to do at different levels. You can see that farmers' decision to use pesticide, which is not, which is something that we need to combine with the determinants to adoption to alternative, strategies of value chain, coordination of stakeholders, market and consumer, public policy, what are the effectiveness of the current one, and what could be innovative policy schemes. So that was the reason why we explicitly put a dedicated topic in the program, growing and protecting crop differently, to have a specific effort on these topics. That was the reason why the FAST project emerged from this idea. And it is also the reason for the meeting today. So thank you very much for attention. Sorry, I think I'll be a little rapid in my presentation, but it's okay.
So hello everyone. I have a few minutes to present to you the content of the program, and more precisely the idea that we had, Florence and I, in mind when we reflected on the topic of the conference, which is to understand how can social sciences build effective policies to reduce pesticides. So today we're going to talk about public policies for reducing pesticides, but it seems to me that most of the answers that will be provided during the conference also probably apply to other public policies. So today and tomorrow, we'll have the chance to listen to researchers in social sciences who follow very different approaches to studying pesticide policies. They will talk to us about modeling, about participatory approaches, about observational studies, about social experiments. However, in all cases, the objective will be to produce findings to inform and support the effectiveness of existing public programs or to create new ones. Thanks to them, we will learn a lot about the role that social sciences can play in the development of public policies, and as I know the content of the program, I can tell you that we're going to learn at least two things during the conference. The first one is that evidence-based policymaking is great, but it's not that simple. And the second one is that social sciences are needed at all stages of the policy process. So the first idea, the fact that providing empirical evidence as inputs to policy decision is an exciting job, but it's not that simple. What we call evidence-based policy making, of course, the idea that science should be used rigorously and comprehensively to inform policy decisions has become increasingly popular in many countries. It is true that the particular form that practice can take when it comes to experimenting with a pilot public program, for example, may not be the most widespread. This is something that will be discussed by Paul Ferraro this afternoon. However, evidence-based policymaking as an attempt to base policy decisions to empirical evidence, in general, whatever the approach you choose, seems to be a view increasingly adopted by public authorities, and this is great. Such an evolution of practices makes sense, of course. Policymaking that is rooted in sound theory and empirical evidence should lead to better policies and regulation. In particular, academic research can help understand the effect of policies, whether or not they have been already implemented. But despite its appeal, however, evidence-based policymaking is easier said than done. I came across a nice paper by Christian Leuze, which sums up very well, in my opinion, the numerous challenges in generating evidence that can inform and support policymaking. There are at least 4 major challenges. The first one is our ability to draw causal inference, or the changes that we observe in the behavior of the individuals, or the result of the implemented public policy, or the result of something else. And the other way around, if I implemented a public policy, what the changes I will observe in the field, in the decisions of individuals in return. So causality plays a central role because without the causal relation, it is very difficult to provide a reliable advice to policymakers or to the public in general. Yet, social sciences face major limitations in their ability to generate causal evidence. This afternoon, our keynote, Paul Ferraro, will talk about social experiments, the gold standard method to draw causal inference. However, it is not always possible to experiment with the public policy. Typically, it would not be possible to experiment with the pesticide tax policy, in which a test group of farmers would be chosen at random. And in cases where it is possible to experiment, you can claim the internal validity of your findings, but of course, their external validity is by definition limited. It's not always possible to generalize to the whole population. There is no shortage of alternatives, of course, but they have their own limits. When you use models to simulate a public policy in order to anticipate the likely consequences, you have to make a number of assumptions about the functions and the parameters you use to describe the real world. And when you run observational studies to estimate the effectiveness of a public program that has not been designed to be evaluated, you have to make a number of assumptions about why some farmers chose to enter the program while others did not. And if you manage to do that, you should then assess your ability to estimate what would have happened to them had they not been into the program. And again, it is a complicated exercise because we cannot time travel, right? So we can observe, we cannot observe what would have happened if, we can observe only what happened. The second challenge for causal evidence and better policy relevant estimates is a lack of relevant data that is sufficiently granular to identify and measure policy effects. Despite the recent increase in the availability of data, we are missing the relevant data for many policy issues that we would like to answer. In many cases, the relevant data do not yet exist, or they do exist, but they are not always available to researchers. We also generally lack exogenously generated data. For example, when a public program is implemented, it is very common to collect data from program participants. The point is that we do not need just information from program participants. We also need to know what happened to those who decided not to participate into the program. And the collection of this type of information is generally not foreseen in the implementation of the program. So at some point, the identification of the impact of the program is a data problem. Thirdly, there are challenges to the reliability of research findings, and for instance, the discretion of the research. The fact that the freedom the researcher has to select the models, the tests, and the results he considers the most relevant for his analysis. This discretion likely plays an important role in the relatively low reproducibility rate, which recently has been documented for several fields, including economics. And I'm not talking about external validity or replicability. I'm talking about reproducibility, the fact that when we run the same analysis using the same data, we find the same results. Aside from discretion, biases in research findings can come from incentives in the publication process. For example, the tendency of editors to favor surprising results. And also, it is generally hard to publish what we call null results. For example, it is difficult to publish a conclusion saying there may be an impact of the pesticide public policy, but the magnitude of the impact cannot be estimated with precision, and the range of possible value is large, and among all these values, we cannot exclude zero. So this is something that you can't publish. Finally, there are a number of challenges related to the transmission of research findings as well as the use of results by policymakers. Promoting evidence makes sense in many ways, but it should be borne in mind that the decision-making process remains political, which can lead to at least two types of problems. The first one is that of the manipulation of scientific evidence by policymakers, something researchers fear most. And the second one, more complex in appearance, is that of focusing the political debate on those problems for which we're able to provide scientific evidence. In sum, the challenges are many, and we must move forward cautiously, but given the potential cost of poorly designed policy, it is generally worth moving into the direction of more systematic use of evidence-based policy making. And this path probably requires the cooperation of researchers and decision makers. This will be one of the many interesting points that will be discussed this afternoon by our keynote, Paul Ferraro. I now come to the second thing that we will learn during this conference. The second thing is that provided social sciences researchers manage to overcome all the obstacles that I've just mentioned, they can contribute to all phases of the policy process. That include problem identification, policy design, implementation, and evaluation. The presentations that you will have the chance to listen today and tomorrow perfectly illustrate the idea that social sciences can provide answers to the questions that we must ask ourselves when we want to build a public policy aimed at solving a major social problem like reduction of pesticides, for example. What to do, how to do well, and how to do better. The first stage of the rocket is the problem identification and the policy formulation phase. What to do, which means what goal to achieve. In some cases, it may be very trivial, but in others, not at all. If I take the example of pesticide reduction, we often ask social sciences why French farmers refuse to abandon the conventional production system in favor of a more sustainable, less polluting one. I have noticed that this is often referred to as the acceptability issue, but this term is quite misused. Increasing acceptability does not mean explaining to farmers that they have to make an effort, that it is their responsibility, or whatever linked to the goodwill of one particular category of the population affected by the transition to a sustainable system. Rather, increasing the acceptability of a pesticide exit solution means identifying the levers that can be operated so that the decision of all participants in the system go in the same direction. And it is a difficult work that requires the contributions from many fields of social sciences, including management sciences, who study problem solving and decision making in human systems, and also from economists, who study the gains that can be generated from certain type of decisions, like collective action, for example. 3 presentations will address this topic during the conference this afternoon. Mourad Anashi and André will talk about the use of serious game to support collective action. Tomorrow, Francesco Vanni will talk about the role of collective action in the Italian case. And tomorrow, also, Niklas Mering will talk about the importance of creating links across actors. And the question that we can ask social sciences is how to do, which means which instruments should we use? So policymakers must not only decide what to do by setting the goals that they have to achieve, but they must also consider how to best solve the problem by evaluating the cost and the effects of the proposed solutions. And as part of this process, they need to decide which policy instruments can best be used to solve the problem. And of course, they usually know the policy instruments they can use, but they usually do not know well the economic incidence of these instruments. In the case of pesticide reduction, for example, they typically know very well that they have a number of instruments in their toolbox. They have the prohibition of the use of pesticides, the recognition of the quality of agri-food products without pesticides, the taxation of pesticides, the subsidized for production system without pesticides, and the provision of agricultural extension and training in zero pesticide practices. But the effect of these instruments are difficult to anticipate and require a thorough understanding of the likely repercussions of their implementing in the system. 3 presentations will deal with this issue during the conference. This morning, Benoît Grimonprez and Inès Bouchema will explain how research in environmental law can help shaping new legal frameworks to promote transition to new agro-food systems. Hugh Waddington will review what policymakers should already know about farm field schools. And this afternoon, Alain Carpentier will discuss the relevance of a pesticide tax in the French context. Another question, which occupies a large number of researchers in social sciences, is that of properly designing public policies. And this requires, in particular, understanding the motivations of the individual targeted by the policy. Behavioral economic researchers are well aware of the importance of understanding the motivations of economic agents, especially if these motivations do not match well with the standard theory. And for example, we do know that individuals value rewards in exchange for their environmental effort. But what kind of rewards? Do they want cash rewards, other types of rewards? And can we design more efficient public policy that can save money by offering some relevant types of incentives to people who chose to enroll into the transition? A number of presentations will deal with this issue during the presentation, during the conference. This morning, Sophie Thoyer will talk about approaches that can be used to design more efficient pesticide policies in the European context, in the European framework. Helena Hansson will talk about the impediments faced by farmers in the Swedish context. And this afternoon, Jaap Sok will tell us to what extent it is possible to change the habits of the farmers, looking at the side of the theory of planned behavior. My last point is about the ability of social sciences to analyze what has been done before and elsewhere, what has worked and what has not. In many cases, ex post evaluation can help, but in most of the time it is quite a difficult exercise, as I said before. Two of my colleagues have tried this, choosing to study the DEFI program, a program emblematic of the French government's efforts to support the farmers in the search of alternative production systems. We also have the chance to listen to Robert Finger tomorrow morning, who will provide new insights in farmers' decisions to reduce pesticides from the Swiss case. Well, I hope you will enjoy the program as much as I had the pleasure to make it with Florence and with the speakers here in the room and in remote. And I wish you an excellent conference.
Many thanks for your invitation. It is always dangerous to ask lawyers to speak, especially in English. In fact, to get out of chemical pesticides, law has a major role to play in addition to other sciences. Any public policy to be implemented must be transformed into legal rules. Unlike other social norms, the legal norms is recognized by institutions and guaranteed by the state system. However, law is not only a regulation. Economic norms like labels, contract, taxes are also part of it. In terms of method, the lawyer reflects on the current text and the major unwritten principle like hierarchy of norm. He also looks at how the rules are applied by judge and economics operator. Sorry. So, how can legal decision help to get out of pesticide? We will provide an answer in two stages. First, it is a question of knowing how the law integrates health and socio-economic consideration into its system. The relationship between law and other sciences is part of the matter. Then, inside the law itself, what are the norms that allow to reduce the pesticides? What combination of instruments should be favored? Now, I leave for the first part the floor to Inès Bouchema.
So, law beyond its walls. C'est à droite, je crois. Yeah. Law beyond its walls. That's the first part of this presentation. It means that I will explore how law receives, integrates, and uses scientific knowledge foreign to law when it comes to pesticides. Basically, I tile my part in two. No, get back, please. First, how law integrates hard sciences, and then how law integrates social sciences. But yeah, you can turn. But before I start, just a few words on how law applies to pesticide. Surely it is already well known by all of you, but in Europe, the principle is that every plant protection product, every pesticide, has to be firstly authorized. But it is important to distinguish between substance and final product. because the first one are authorized at European level, while the final product are authorized at the national level. And in addition to the evaluation procedures and the authorization, law can also edict special restriction on the use of pesticides. Like, for example, I'm not a farmer, so I don't have the right to use pesticide in France, basically. So, giving legal effect to hard sciences. Law beyond its role. In this part, I will explain how law gives legal effects to sciences, to science data. It is the whole purpose of the evaluation procedure. The evaluation procedure is so designed because after review of all available scientific information on a substance or a product, the risk and the benefits are known. But without this evaluation procedure, jurists will not be able to evaluate pesticides and their danger. Plus proche, okay. In case of pesticide, European law defines first the adverse effect or the efficiency, and then recognize scientific guidelines to evaluate them. And we, as jurists, often say that law is a fiction. So it means that law qualifies, we define an object, and then we design rules that are applying to them. But as long as an object is not defined by law, it has no legal existence. So it means, like, for example, the endocrine disruptors, they weren't defined by the law, and so they weren't taken into account during the evaluation procedure. Same applies right now to SDHE, which are not defined yet, and therefore not considered during the evaluation process. Defining is a really important step, but it's not neutral. It has bias, and it recognizes some aspects more than others. To get back to endocrine disruptor, for example, the discussion lasts 10 years, the negotiation lasts 10 years to come out with a definition, but for many specialists, the adopted definition is still controversial and not enough. So defining is not neutral. But when we've done that, how can we evaluate that a pesticide, for example, is efficient or has a side effect? You can turn, tu peux passer. So how to measure these effects? And how we, jurists, not really hard scientists, how can we understand the research that proves that a particular product is toxic or efficient? And worse, we don't even know how to recognize good from bad science. So what do we do? So to address this issue and to ensure that it is fair, that the authorization is fair, European law recognizes some specific test and protocol, so we know that the outcome of the test will be scientifically correct, rigorous. For example, to test efficiency of a product, the protocol says that it has to be compared with an untreated control group and with one product of reference. It means what? That, for example, if I want to place on the market a new herbicide, I will have to prove that in comparison to plant without any protection, it is efficient, but also that it is at least as good as glyphosate, which would be the reference product. And some social scientists, like, for example, Jean-Noël Jouzel, have brought to light that this protocol lacks the definition at also his bias. In Europe, it favors toxicology over epidemiology. This means that, for example, it is harder to give credit to studies that showing a low-dose effect or cocktail effect from pesticide. You might have heard, for example, the controversy about glyphosate, about the carcinogenicity of glyphosate. The WHO agency, the YARC, recognized glyphosate as probably carcinogenic, while the European Union, the European agency, did not. Why? One of the reasons is that because they didn't use the same protocol and the same studies. They didn't validate the same result. And so they come out with two different assessments. But nevertheless, as jurists, it is only because this evaluation procedure exists that we can say that a substance is toxic, either for human or for the environment. So But what happens when a potential danger is revealed after the evaluation? Je pense que tu peux tourner. Ah oui, tu peux encore tourner. Ouais. Non, c'est bon, tu y étais. Reviens en arrière. So first, the producer of pesticide have an obligation to share the data if they shown that, that there is a problem with their product. And then, in case of new evidence of harmfulness of pesticide released by, for example, public researcher, action remains possible. And even if this research, this public research, doesn't really fit with the guidelines that are and the protocols that are in place. So national and European agencies have the possibility to consider this new information and to suspend their authorization. We call it emergency measure. Like in the case of STHC, for example, the French national agency in charge of pesticide authorization is currently conducting a study on their potential adverse effects on health, and this research may lead to restriction of use of this product. So even if this system is not perfect yet, it assures that the decision on putting or removing a pesticide on the market is not arbitrary, but rely on true science and facts. The judges also may play a great role, but in their role, they are relatively free. They can take into account almost any sciences and even design some experts to do their assessment. So, tu peux passer à la deuxième. Now we come to the second part, and maybe for you the most interesting part, how law recognize effects to social sciences and social sciences. What is their role when it comes to pesticides? First, when it comes to pesticides, social sciences play an important role when it comes to exit and to ban one product. Because European law allows, in some exceptional cases, to compare a chemical product with a non-chemical solution or prevention method that is already commonly used in the country. So, for example, in France, we use this possibility with glyphosate. For all the use where an alternative solution already was well in place, the use of glyphosate was banned. And here, to this topic, social sciences were really important to assess that this practice was indeed well used in the farmer population. They also came into account when it comes to evaluate the consequences, the social consequences of glyphosate ban, for example. We have in the room someone who really worked hard on evaluate the financial consequences of a glyphosate ban for a French farmer when it comes to it. So that's a really important role of social sciences. And then you should know that it is always the case, law tries to balance contradictory interests. Interest in competition. For example, restriction to commerce or to property are possible only if they are proportionate and useful to protect another interest like health or environment. And in this exercise, again, social sciences are key. For example, right now we know that the European Farm-to-Fork strategy set a goal of 50% reduction of pesticide use. The question is, at what agronomic, economical, and social cost? And with the actual negotiation of this reform on the European Directive on Pesticide Use, these questions are asked to social scientists. Some data published really recently by the GRC trend to show that the reduction of pesticide use could result on a loss of food production and higher food prices. So, once again, the expertise of economics is really important to anticipate the consequences of the public decision making. And another example of this role is the case of neonicotinoid in France. With the precaution principle, we banned neonicotinoid. We were bad for the bees, but the question was, yes, but we leave the beet grower without any protection of solution. And so, once again, the economic aspect, well documented by scientists, on the accessibility of an alternative product, and on this cost for the farmer were documented and used to say, okay, for the sugar industry, we are lifting the ban because there is no solution for them right now. So, in comparison with hard sciences, social sciences are more indirectly taken into account by the policymaker, but it's not, that does not mean that it has no role. And I think that your role, our role as social scientists, is even by design, is more likely to design the law. Economy and other social sciences lights public decision and help deciders to choose between all the legal instruments, the one that are most suitable to achieve their goal. Shall we tax? Shall we ban? Shall we encourage some practical products? And before saying more, I leave the floor to give it to Benoît Grimonprez, who will exactly speak about this topic.
Now, within the folds of the law, after having seen how the law integrates data from other sciences, we will analyze its internal functioning. Firstly, which branches of law are involved in accelerating the exit from pesticides. Indeed, the legal system is like a tree made up of multiple branches: agricultural law, climate law, market law, etc. Secondly, we will ask, within these different kinds of law, which spaces, like seeds, of normative instruments are the most relevant. Pesticides and legal branches. In order to reduce the products, public policies tend to go through pesticide law. This is quite natural. One solution is to tighten the condition for placing products on the market or to regulate their use more strictly. Just one example. We could imagine extending the comparative assessment procedure between conventional products and the alternative for marketing authorization. This analysis could be based on a number of criteria: effectiveness, harmfulness, economic cost, or availability of equipment. Another way is through the law of the Common Agricultural Policy. The greening of CAP is already reflected in the conditionality of aid payments. Criteria linked to untrade areas and the adoption of low input practice could be added for aid under the first and second pillars. For example, in catchment areas with drinking water issue, specific agri-ecological measures could be based on the abandonment of pesticides. Moreover, water law is currently the main lever for reducing the use of pesticides. Indeed, it makes it possible to obtain the support of the actor attached to the preservation of this common heritage. Water quality justifies measures to protect water courses, but also drinking water catchment areas. In these areas, action programs have been set up. Many of them deal with pesticides. More recently, quantitative water management has been used. In some areas, like the Sèvres, Vienne in France, it has been decided collectively to make access to water conditional on agroecological commitments by irrigators. To be able to continue to take water, they must obtain results, especially in terms of pesticide use. I will end this inventory with the law of biodiversity. It is central to the issue of pesticides. First, this law contains defense measures to protect the wildlife. In France, a pollinator plan is currently being adopted. It provides for reforming the rules on the use of products during the flowering period with a systematic risk assessment and treatment schedules. More positive measures exist also, this time to diversify plant cover. This could be an incitative or an obligation to plant hedge, trees, fallow lawns, flower strips, obviously untread. I could continue this demonstration with many other legal branches. But now, I would like to discuss the various possible normative techniques. This can be top-down, coming from the public authorities to impose themselves on the actor. They can also be bottom-up, created by the actors themselves and spread. The tendency is to pit the instruments against each other, isolating the strategy. For example, prohibiting or taxing a practice. However, the instruments must be considered together. We need to understand how they fit together. At this stage, I have identified 3 types of interesting combinations. First, there are strategies that are not easily compatible. It is a question of regulating and paying at the same time. As soon as a practice is prohibited, it can no longer be contracted. This is why certain payments are linked to the fact that the change in practice is voluntary. A payment implies additionality to existing standards. On the other hand, it doesn't seem possible to subsidize and remunerate at the same time. This is a whole problem of combining certain type of funding. For example, agroecological measures and payments for environmental services. I will also say that certain ecological practices, according to international law, can only be compensated for their additional cost. The WTO agreements refuse to pay a fair price for them. The European Union has so far followed this position. Another combination is that of complementary instrument. The idea: certain instruments used alone are not effective. They need to be combined with other measures. I will take 3 assumptions. The first is risk insurance. This is an important tool, but it can lead farmers to take more risk and therefore to increase the use of products. In this case, we must be coupled with appropriate regulatory measures on the land use. For example, a ban on turning over grassland or limiting the quantity of treatment. Second hypothesis is a reform of agricultural advice to favor alternative. This is essential, but it must be accompanied by an insurance mechanism to cover the new risk for advisor and user. One cannot go without the other. Third hypothesis, subsidize and regulate use. It is useful to provide economic assistance to exit a practice if we know it will be banned. This measure must be linked over time. We have no proof that subsidizing without exit prospect is expensive and ineffective. This is a difference between the withdrawal of neonicotinoids, which has already been decided in France, and the withdrawal of glyphosate, which is still being postponed. Fourth hypothesis, if pesticides are taxed in one country, it is necessary to regulate trade in products from other countries. Harmonizing standards is a condition for own companies to remain competitive. The last combination is that of additional instruments. They can be used on their own, but when combined, they make public policies more effective. I will cite two examples. Firstly, we can subsidize and certify. This involves making public aid conditional on a system of individual or collective certification. This encourages a systemic approach and action program in the territory. The same reasoning can be applied to aid for the consumption of labeled products. For example, a food voucher is given to buy products recognized as pesticide-free. It's possible to extend the rule to public procurement. We will create a positive discrimination criteria for production committed to a certified approach. Another association could be to tax and subsidize, or tax-free. Here, the assumption is that taxation will make pesticides more expensive and that the proceeds of the tax will be allocated to alternative practice. The idea is to erase the additional cost of the tax by redistributing it to new uses to become less expensive, like organic farming, biocontrol, etc. Naturally, this presentation is far from exhaustive. There are many other possible combinations, surely more complex. For Jans, the objective is to offer public decision makers a global strategy that involves all the levers, all the players, and all the levels of organization. Thank you for your attention. And for the question, my colleague Inès Bouchema, who speaks better than I do, better English than I do, we are able to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, I think we have time for questions.
We will start with the question from the audience. And remember that we have to use the microphone. Yes, the microphone. Ah, okay. Pas de problème.
Thank you for the presentation. You hear me? It's fine. On m'entend? Okay. Okay. So, as I know, globally in law there is trade-offs when you have principle and you have the application, and sometimes you have to balance many trade-offs to applicate the law. For example, in antitrust laws, sometimes there is some arrangement that are prohibited, but we accept it because they have good things it's a good thing for society, or it provides some services that we cannot. My question is, in agriculture, we have some trade-offs like this, and we see that, for example, the glyphosate, it's prohibited, then we say, okay, there is a moratoire. I don't know how we say moratoire in English, but we open the prohibition because there is special needs. My question is, this exception can be durable in law or not? Is those exception for law application can be just on sometimes, but not extended in time? Or is it possible to be durable? Thank you.
In this case, when, for example, we decide to ban a substance or a product, normally it applies to all. But the typical example is the neonicotinoid. Or the ban was set. We were going to ban all uses of neonicotinoids, but then a problem showed up in sugar beet industry, and so we decided to allow and to make an exemption for sugar beet industry. And this is legal. Why? Because this lifting of the ban came back before the parliament, the French parliament, and they decided and they set conditions to the lifting of this ban. But so it is possible, but it has to come back through the parliament. And so we take another law, basically. a law can always defect a law. So we can always go back, but it means that we have to draw a new law and negotiate again, and so it's hard to have this. And in the case of neonicotinoid, it's really cool as a banning on for the sugar industry only, not for maize or anything else. Did I answer your question? Perfect.
Maybe you can introduce yourself when you raise a question.
So thanks a lot for the presentation. My name is Niklas Möhring. I'm a fellow of the Swiss National Science Foundation at CNRS. And my question was, so you talked about the importance of socioeconomic studies, but how can a jurist actually judge the quality of a socioeconomic study? Because we know as economists, depending on the assumptions you make in models, you can have very different results, and that's very important for the quality of the study in the end. And that's sometimes even hard for us as economists. So if you would put 10 studies there, 9 say this is should be forbidden, and 1 says this should not be forbidden, but this is the one study that actually used the correct assumptions, then how would you judge that in the process?
Basically, we can't. That's why for the hard sciences, we design protocol and we say, okay, if it is produced in this way, we know for sure the result is correct. But for social sciences, we can't. And that's also why economical studies are indirectly taken into account and not directly in the regulation. And often, at least in France, social economic studies are financed by the government, or by the ones that will be taken into account are financed by the government and by the agency. So we know that basically studies and results published by Lancet or INRAE will be more just than the ones that are not specially commanded by the government. But we can't judge your work. We don't understand a clue, so we can't judge, not at all.
Okay, we have one question from those people that are connected on live storm. One question from Henriette Christensen from Pesticide Action Network Europe. She asked,
She explained.
yes, she explained, Canada decided in 2003 that mayors can decide over their own territory regarding pesticide spraying, while in France, mayor cannot. In Italy, the Italian administrative court has several cases, rules in favor of mayors. In the Danish administrative court also has rules in favor of a Danish town that has decided to ban pesticides. So the question is there anything that that Europe could do in helping member states to move forward the Canadian reality?
How to answer this question? Basically, in France, the problem was that the mayors are not competent. They don't have the right to decide whether or not you can spray pesticides on their territories, because it's how France works. In France, all question relative to pesticides is decided by the French Ministry of Agriculture, and you can do whatever you want. It will always come back to the French Minister of Agriculture. But in other countries, like for example in Italy, where the regions are really different and they may have different competences, then maybe in Italy or in Germany, a region could have the competence, the right to decide to ban pesticides. But we can't really do anything at the European level because that is linked to how a country works, and this is still in the hand of each country. Each country decides how it works, and it is quite fair from a law point of view. So to this matter, we can't really do anything at the European level, to my opinion.
Okay, if there are anything else,
Any question in the room or in the people that are outside?
remote.
If it's not the case, so
Si.
Christian.
Thank you. I'm Christian Wig from Scientific Director of INRAE. Thank you very much for your presentation. There were plenty of very good items. In fact, one thing that is not clear for me, and I very much like when you said that we need to very well identify what is the object. And it shows how it is important to focus on the molecules more than on the process. But the regulation 1107-2009 is really a basement of every change, but it is fully based on pesticide and fully based on the substitution approach. So you can only replace one pesticide by another pesticide with just a minor exception on the article 50-2. How to take into account the fact that this has been made in a context, so the early 2000s, when pesticide was the only option. How to change that, and how do you take this into account to make the proposition for the next one, where pesticide is not anymore the single solution, or even anymore the solution. So how to take the mindset on board and the societal mindset.
That's basically the whole theme of my PhD study, that I don't have any answer yet. But what you say, it's really, okay, what do we do? Because the regulation that had been conceived in 2009 was indeed redacted with the idea that pesticide was key and that we needed it. And now we are thinking that maybe pesticides are not the only solution and may not be at all a solution. But we still have this regulation that is in place, and we can, our party is that even in this regulation, we can already twist it to value and to implement alternatives. But at the end, if the goal is really to exit from pesticides, this regulation won't have any utility anymore. It won't be. It may be still in place, but if we don't use any pesticide at all, you don't need a regulation to place on the market the pesticide. But I can't really answer your question because the path to go to this regulation to no regulation on the pesticide placing on the market is really complicated, and I think the whole project of FAST to discover this path to change the law.
But all the biological control products have to go through this regulation, and they are completely in a different approach, because a pesticide is there for killing. This is why it is side. While biological control is there for regulating, for controlling, so not killing. So in any case, it's going not to have the same process of action. So even if we try to twist this regulation, it will never make the job. So how, this is to my mind really a very hard piece in our story. Either we adapt to that, and in that case it will never work, but it is in the landscape. So how to establish something next to it that is preparing the future. So really your contribution is really, really important. You have a maximum pressure on your shoulders.
Exactly.
There is a last remark and question from Ariane Christensen. She said that regarding neonicotinoid derogation, Pan-Europe, I mean the organization she is working in, is arguing that at least that should result in common agricultural policy funding being removed for the farmers or sectors in question. What do you think about that argument? Should we remove any kind of cap funding for sugar beet producers, let's say?
En fait, la question c'est, comme on a interdit les néonicotinoïdes, est-ce que du coup, comme on l'a interdit, on ne devrait pas arrêter les subventionnements de la PAC pour ceux qui utilisent encore des néonicotinoïdes?
It's an example of combining two incentives, in fact.
Exactly, it could be.
There's a derogation. All the number of countries use of the derogation for neonicotinoids, but it concerns a number of countries.
It will
important.
It will not be acceptable from a law point of view to remove cap subsidy in this case. I guess it will not be acceptable from a law point.
From a law point of view, why not? Because, sorry. For a law point of view, why not? Because we can ban or we can correlate subsidies to some type of action, like not using some kind of pesticide. It could be by the law completely possible, but the question is the acceptation of this policy. And here we come. Here's the cliff between law, what law say, and hello, and what policymaker will do to be re-elected and to defend also the interest of sugar roots farmers. I don't think that France will, after lifting the ban of neonicotinoid, allow to just cut the funding of sugar roots farmers. But it's a political point of view and not a law problem, actually.
Okay, thank you. So there is no more question from the remote people. If you don't have any more questions, we have a coffee break and be back there at 11. Okay? 11 o'clock.
So my name is Sophie Thoyer. I work at the Center for Environmental Economics in Montpellier, just like Julie here. And I'm not really presenting something on cap and pesticides. That's an old title, sorry. I coined you with this one. No, I want to show to you how we can mobilize experimental approaches to enrich the policy evaluation toolbox, and in particular, how we can evaluate ex ante, before implementation, new policy designs. So my presentation will be structured in 3 parts. One is, why should we need to enrich the policy evaluation toolbox of the CAP now? What has changed? So I will try to spend not too much time on this. Then I will illustrate this with 3 examples from the pesticide sector, how the experimental approaches have helped us analyze new policy designs. And if I have time, I will also describe to you some of the difficulties we have with conducting experimental approaches. All right, so maybe our non-EU friends do not know well the Common Agricultural Policy. For others, it might be quite common. But one of the novelty of the post-2020 CAP is what we call the new delivery model. And that's not anecdotal, this. It means that we are shifting from a result-based governance approach to, sorry, not result-based, sorry, from a process-based governance approach to a performance-based governance approach. Basically, before, member states were expected to implement in their own countries all the rules, targets, and types of policy designs that were decided at the EU level in Brussels. And now we have shifted to a system where member states are granted much more freedom to choose their own policy designs and to try to reach their own assigned, self-assigned targets, of course, approved by the European Commission. And this changes a little bit the landscape because it means that we can be much more innovative in the way we are designing new policies, and especially new policies for the reduction of pesticide use. Because on top of this, there is another novelty, which is eco-schemes. Eco-schemes is the fact that now, so from 2023, because again, it's the post-2020 CAP, but it's only going to be set in place in 2023, is the fact that 25% of the direct payments of the CAP will be dedicated to programs which are voluntary for farmers, so farmers can enroll voluntarily in favor of the environment. So member states have this responsibility and are actually currently drafting their national strategic plans in which they are describing these eco-schemes and in which they are describing their whole strategy for implementing the CAP in their own countries with policy designs which are tailored to their needs and to their constraints. So why is it important? Well, because that calls for, of course, the need to demonstrate impact, because member states will be, to some extent, judged on their capacity to reach their targets, their announced targets. There is more emphasis on innovative approaches, and this needs to be maybe ex ante evaluated. There is an emphasis also, at least in a number of EU member states, from what I saw from the first drafts of the national strategic plans, which have already been released, on collective commitments, coordinated commitments. And there is also this need, and that's set by the Farm to Fork very ambitious objectives, that we don't need only to persuade those farmers who are already convinced, but also to bring into a major change those who haven't changed yet. So we need to have major, large-scale behavioral changes. And this calls for new evaluation techniques and new evaluation tools. Well, first, because CAP is under more scrutiny, so it needs to demonstrate impact, as I said before, and it's accountable. Member states are now accountable for their, the way they have, for their policy choices. So they need to demonstrate that they are having an impact. And something else which is new as well, well, there has been an acceleration of CAP reforms over the last 3 decades, but now there will be the possibility to have an annual revision of the strategic national plans. So it means that we need to evaluate quickly and in a flexible way what has happened in the previous year to be able to adjust for the next year. There is also this possibility to have more innovation. There will be much more heterogeneity in the way we implement policy design. So we also need to have more flexible evaluation instruments. And also there's this change in evaluation focus. Before we were looking more at the market impact, now we are looking at the farm level impact, we're looking at compliance, enrollment. We have these 2 elements of, at the same time, we have stronger regulations, as was shown just before by Benoît and Inès, but we also have a much wider range of voluntary approaches, and that calls for understanding better what are the farmers' behavioral responses to those 2 types of policies. So as told you, one of the first most important thing is how can we measure the impact of a policy? And the difficulty is, of course, to disentangle what is attributable to the policy itself and what is related to other confounding, that's the economics word, factors. And here, for example, I just give you this example. If we had a policy to reduce pesticide use, and so we want to see what is its impact, so we implement the policy. Well, I cannot show you, well, I can show you, at least for those who are in the room. Oh, yes, this is very small, the policy, and that's the time of evaluation. Well, and we are implementing an agri-environmental measure which will encourage farmers to adopt more, better conservation practices, for example. Well, the intuition maybe would be to say, well, let's compare the with and without situation. So if we do this, what happens is we will be comparing point A, which is where the farmers who have enrolled into the agri-environmental measure, with point D, which are the farmers who haven't enrolled in the agri-environmental measures, okay? Is it the true impact? Well, not sure, because as you can see on those lines here, the green and the blue lines, they are different. Farmers who have enrolled haven't got the same characteristics, observable or non-observable, as those who have enrolled, okay? And it means that we are not capturing the true impact, the true causal impact. The other intuition is to say, okay, let's look at before and after. So let's compare, for example, for those who have enrolled, point C, okay, let's get rid of this, with point A. But again, there is another type of bias, which is what we call the time trend bias. So we need to get rid of those 2 biases. We need to build a true counterfactual. This is what was announced by Julie. That is the situation, what would have happened without the policy, to be able to measure the true causal impact, which is this red arrow that you can see here. And this is exactly what experimental approaches can do. And this is why it is useful for for the CAP and for member states as well. So let me skip this because I'm going to be a bit late otherwise. But experimental approaches, I won't have time to explain to you all what it's about, but instead of, basically it's, instead of relying on observational data, on naturally occurring data, let's generate our own data in a controlled environment. With this method, then we are able, to some extent, to control for the confounding factors, at least know where they are, and be able to identify more precisely the causal impact of a policy. So this is what it says here, and the main instrument for this is randomization. Is basically have a control group and a treatment group and compare the situation or the outcomes of those two groups. And if it's properly randomized, if the assignment is properly done, then we can measure this impact. So unfortunately, I won't have time to explain to you how all of this works. It's a bit complicated. We have a wide range of experimental approaches. You're probably very much familiar, I'm not talking to economists here, I know they are, but others, with these social experiments. Here they have this barbaric acronym RCTs, randomized controlled trials, which is basically what you know with clinical research. And I'm not going to explain to you what clinical research is about because we've heard about this for the last 18 months with vaccine things. So, but what you have to be aware of is these randomized controlled trials, they're very good to evaluate ex post, the policies. So that's useful, and this is what Paul Ferraro will be talking about this afternoon. So let's forget about this one. But we can also imagine to set up experiments, but in a much more flexible way for ex-ante evaluation. For example, in the lab with students, where we will strip down the economic problem that we want to evaluate to its fundamentals, basically, and let students play a game, and we can, again, assign students to a control group and a treatment group and compare the situation. And this is what we can do. So very often what we do, when we do this with lab experiments, we do this with very decontextualized games. So, we're talking about tokens, things like this, not about pesticides, land, and problems of investment. So in between, we have what we call field experiments, which is, okay, maybe students do not behave exactly like farmers, so can we bring the lab to the field and play the same game with farmers? Exactly the same game? Well, maybe not. Maybe we need to contextualize a little bit more. So this is what I'm going to illustrate to you with the issue of pesticides. So, sorry, I have used only my work, my research work. It's not because it's better than the others, but it's because I master it better, okay? So, and I'll show you how we can use the full range of experimental approaches to evaluate some new innovative policy designs. The first question we had, and that was evaluated in the lab with students, was, okay, could we evaluate a scheme, so it's an agri-environmental scheme, in which enrolled farmers are paid only if a collective threshold of participation is attained. Why should we do that? Well, in a number of cases, it may have value. For example, here, you know that, at least in France, that's the regulation, if you want to pump groundwater to then treat it for drinkable water, you have to make sure that this groundwater hasn't got a pesticide concentration which is greater than 5 micrograms per liter. All right, if this pumping system is threatened because the concentration level is too high, we want to pay farmers around the area to reduce their use of pesticide. But it's only useful if we are able to reach, to go below this threshold level. Otherwise, we have paid farmers for nothing, meaning, anyway, we will have to move the pumping site elsewhere, and this is going to cost a lot of money. Okay, so if we have a system where we only pay when, for example, X% of the total area is enrolled into the scheme, does it discourage farmers from entering the scheme, from enrolling? That's a valid question. And we worked on this, in the lab, and we compared two incentive mechanisms: contracts, agri-environmental contracts, with individual payments, subsidies, which are proportional to individual environmental efforts. This is mimicking agri-environmental measures. Of course, in the lab, it wasn't labeled this way. It was really, for the economist, it was a game of voluntary contribution to a threshold public good. All right? But this is what it mimicked. And then we had, so that was, if you want, the control. And then we had the treatment, which is same contracts, same payments, but payments are conditional on the attainment of a collective threshold of environmental efforts. So we needed to have a sufficient number of students enrolling into the contract to then pay them. So, as I told you, that was entirely conducted in a context-free setting. And the theoretical predictions is if the subjects are risk neutral, there is no difference between the two. So we were asking ourselves, in the lab, is it the same thing happening? Well, yes, the results is the conditional payment, on average, does not deter contribution to the public good. So does not deter the enrollment of subjects into the contract. And then we were able to analyze a number of things that were useful to bring into the field, like, for example, the success of the first round is very important, or the role of risk attitudes. So that was encouraging. Why did we do this? We did this because we said, okay, if it works in the lab, there is a slight chance that it might work in the field. So that's the first thing, and it didn't cost too much money. Then we decided to move into the field. Well, that's complicated. Why? Because saying to farmers, you provide the effort, you reduce your use of pesticide, and then you will be paid only if the other farmers have done the same. This is putting fire into the countryside. So we couldn't do that. When we brought this idea, everybody said, we don't want this. Oh, we're too worried. And I understand. So we said, oh, okay, let's reverse the situation and say, let's pay a bonus to the farmers who have enrolled if a threshold of participation has been attained at the local level, all right? So it's not being paid, but it's being paid more, all right? So it's evaluating the efficiency of a conditional bonus, individual bonus, but to increase the participation in agri-environmental schemes. And so you could say to me, well, that's a stupid idea. I mean, if you pay farmers more, of course they will enroll more because they will gain more money. So the question was a bit more subtle than this. It was, if I offer a contract with this conditional bonus, would farmers be willing to enroll into the scheme for a much lower individual payment? And the lowering, reducing their willingness to accept for this, let's move away from this vocabulary. But we were hoping that the reduction of the individual payments that they would be willing to accept would be greater than the increase of payment associated with the payment of the bonus. And this is exactly what happened. So here we are playing with farmers. And we used something that I haven't described, which is called discrete choice experiments, where farmers answer a survey where they are confronted to hypothetical situations, and they have to choose their preferred option, all right? And so we conducted this experiment with more than 300 wine growers in the south of France. It was a contract for the reduction of herbicide use, so something where there is no technical constraint, basically. We know how to do it without herbicide. And we had this attribute that you see here, which is this conditional bonus. In some options it was included, and in others it wasn't. And it's a bonus which says, after the 5 year of the program, if more than 50%, if at least 50% of the total area of the cooperative is enrolled into the program, then each enrolled farmer will get an additional payment on top of his individual payment, which is this bonus. And this is what we found out, is that farmers, well, wine not farmers, wine growers in this area, and that's important to say that, they liked the bonus. They liked the, this agri-environmental scheme offering this bonus. They liked it so well, so much, that they were willing to reduce the individual payments that they get by a much greater amount than the expected bonus. And this is great. It means we can increase the participation of farmers, increase the enrolled area, increase the impact for a much lower aggregated cost, public spending, okay? So that's great, that's very encouraging, but does this result is replicable elsewhere? What we found, and we hope without too many biases linked to our analysis, what we found for wine growers in the south of France, is it valid elsewhere for potato growers, sugar beet growers elsewhere? Well, we don't know. So how can we enlarge generalize the results? Last example, it's something a bit different, but again, with something with pesticide issues. And that was a social experiment, but basically a randomized controlled trial, but not used for ex post evaluation, but used more as a pilot study for ex ante evaluation. And you know that, well, we have some issues with let's say that differently. The observation was that in wine cooperatives, they want to encourage farmers, wine growers, sorry, to switch from traditional chemical pesticides to biocontrol. All right? But the first bottleneck is the fact that farmers are not interested. They don't even come to information meetings where this is explained to them. And so we thought, how can we encourage farmers to get some interest in these new techniques? How can we make sure that they come at least to the information meeting? So we didn't use any money, we used a nudge. So a nudge is this kind of non-monetary incentive that you change a little bit the behavior of people. And we wanted to measure whether a simple nudge, a social comparison nudge, would have an effect first on farmers' intention to participate to meetings, but farmers' intention then to enroll into a biocontrol agri-environmental measure. And this was a work conducted together also with Julie, and we never published it. And she said something about publication biases. Well, that's maybe one of them. We got no results, so we don't get published. But a null result doesn't mean that the result has no value or no validity, okay? So, well, we haven't really battled very strongly for this, but anyway. So that was our first try at a randomized controlled trial. So we randomized wine growers into two groups, and that was very simple. We just used an event that was programmed by the cooperative. So they were invited for this information meeting, which was on biocontrol. And they got a flyer to be invited, and half of them got the invitation letter with this information, and the other half, the treated group, got exactly the same message, the same flyer, except for the red circle except what is in the red circle, which said what? This is what we call a social comparison nudge. It said, hey guys, no, it doesn't say hey guys, but it says already 5,500 hectares are protected by biocontrol in the whole region, in the whole department. And also, and that was the additional nudge, in 2017, the guys from the competing cooperative next door, they will be fully engaged into this biocontrol system. Okay? And we are hoping that by sort of nudging them with this information, they will come to the information and maybe engage more, because we believe that maybe we have this kind of implicit competition between them. Well, at the usual levels of confidence, we could not detect an effect with this randomized controlled trial. It doesn't mean that it didn't have an effect. It just means, at least it means that the sample size, maybe the effect was too small and couldn't be captured by the sample size. Well, I give you this example, but there were many more interesting RCTs that were conducted, often with nudges with very little effect. So that's just a few. How much time do I have left? No more?
5 minutes more.
Oh, 5 minutes, that's okay.
You say
So
three.
just a few.
She says 3, 4.
No,
Let's say
but
4.
let me conclude with this. So some methodological stakes, because I'm saying experimental approaches can help. It doesn't mean it's a standalone methodology, but it can complement other evaluation policies. So here, what I'm saying, what I've tried to illustrate with you, imperfectly, but is we can move from, lab experiments, which is if you were trying to build a new plane, would be a bit like the wind tunnel testing, okay, towards then moving to field experiments with farmers, with more contextualized protocols, which is basically testing a prototype, all right? And then maybe move to social experiments, RCTs, which would be a bit like test flights, all right? And of course, this would be the ideal way of organizing this, but this is not that easy. But if we could do a little bit of all of this, we could maybe avoid wasting money into policies that are not effective in the end, all right? So that could be an interesting path to go. So this means contextualizing the protocol and recruiting participants, of course, when we move from left to right. And just one thing is, it's very hard to convince policymakers with the results of a lab experiment. Of course, the first thing they will say, subjects. We're talking about students and we're talking about stakes that are between 10 and 20 euros. That's not the real life, okay? It's much easier to convince them with randomized controlled trials. But then this is much harder to implement. So I won't discuss all of this, but just to say that there is an area, an under-researched area that should really be researched more, which is how do we, when we move from decontextualized, generic, easily replicable experiments in the lab to very contextualized experiments, how do we contextualize the protocol? How do we move from something which is totally abstract and neutral to something which might be meaningful a little bit for stakeholders who are not subjects, to something which is much more evocative, which can maybe capture the social component of the game and making it more salient, and then maybe why not move to role-playing games, and maybe that's what Mourad will present as well. So that's something for which I think there isn't enough research done. And this was also emphasized by big shots in experimental economics here. Experimenting with farmers, well, it's a nightmare, right, okay? So I'm not going to go over all of this, but for lots of reasons, having access to farmers, just a list of contacts, making sure that our sample is representative, making sure that we reach a sufficient sample size to detect effect, it's all difficult. We have lots of biases. So we also need to work more with public instances, public institutions to help us with those experiments. So let me move to this. That's my last slide. There are a few more pitfalls, as I've already mentioned. Can we really believe that lab experiments approximate real-life behavior? So do students behave like farmers? Well, we have mixed answers about this, and it depends really. And if I had time, I would explain to you where it might be useful just to use students, and we don't even need to move into the farming site and when we need really to work with farmers. It really depends on the type of behavior that we want to understand. There is this issue of quality and replicability of results that was mentioned by Julie. We have a problem with what we call the publication bias. We're not, we as a community of researchers subject to biases. So there is this tendency not to publish null results, for example, but they are as useful as positive results. And we also have, and this is a methodological crisis really, imprecision of results due to the high signal to noise ratio that we can improve with all the suggestions that I've made here. And there is something else. There was a paper, for those who are interested in this, that was published recently about the scaling effect, the voltage effect, I like this word, which is, in fact, the treatment effect size diminishes when the policy is rolled out at a larger scale. What does it mean? It means with an experiment, even an RCT, we may find a positive, significant effect of a policy. And then when we implement, now we are, as policymakers, reassured that this works. When we implement it at a much larger scale, for example, at the national scale, then it doesn't work anymore, all right? So there are a number of explanations for this, but this also explains the reluctance of policymakers sometimes to listen to us, and we need to improve on this. And this is just my last slide. I won't comment it, but just on when we work with farmers, we can have this type of reactions. That's the reaction I got last month with an experiment to elicit their risk attitudes. And I haven't translated the last bit, but for the non-French speakers, I'll do that at the coffee break. Thank you.
Sophie, so we have some question on the website, on the.
But we start with the audience in the room.
So, Niklas?
So thanks for the presentation, very interesting. So my name is Niklas again from CNS. So my question is, what seems to be underlying a lot of your studies and also the problems you're talking about is the information. So how is information processed by farmers? How is it collectively basically processed in a collective organization, in cooperatives and so on? How is it taken from one farmer to the other? And did you address this question also in the studies? So for example, with the game with the flyers and so on. And is this something you maybe want to look into, and how would you think, how could we address this?
We haven't addressed it as such, but there are a number of experimental or behavioral studies which address this question. And you're perfectly right that understanding how the information, I say moves, but is transferred from, for example, one farmer to another. That's the first thing. And here there are a number of papers looking at with network analysis, looking at how, who are the lead farmers who it might be more interesting to target, to pass on the information to others, for example. And then the other types of information, types of research that have been conducted by others than me, is also how the information is transformed from the way you convey it and how it is understood and interpreted by farmers. This, right now, I'm not sure I have a paper in mind, but and often there are papers which are maybe more conducted by social psychologists or psychologists, and they don't necessarily work with farmers. We have a few rural studies, which have done this in the past, not with experimental approaches, but that look at this. And that would be interesting to maybe do this in an experimental setting to really understand that better.
Hi, Sophie. My name's Hugh, Sharma, Waddington. I've come from London School of Hygiene. So thanks for the really excellent presentation. My question is about this concept about publication bias. So I'm very sad to hear that even an RCT can't get published in a economics journal. And so my question is that because it's not worth submitting because you're sure it's not going to get published? And second of all, if not, will the study results be made publicly available through a working paper, so it is available for a meta-analysis?
Okay, so first of all, I just want to moderate a little bit. That was for the sake of the example. We haven't fought very strongly to have this paper published because it was a kind of pilot study. It was a try. It was a way to work together. And we could have done better. So probably that's the reason. Yes, there is a working paper. I can send it to you. And yes, sometimes null results get published. We, with a colleague of mine, Raphaël Prégé, we organized a special issue for INRAE, for European Review of Agricultural Economics, on experimental approaches to evaluate the CAP in 2019. And one of the papers that was, you weren't a co-author, Julie, I don't think so, but it was a paper, it was an RCT, and on the use of water metering systems and how farmers would or not reduce their use of water if they are told that others use more or less water than them, okay? And we couldn't, the authors couldn't find any detectable effect, but it was published anyhow. Now we know that we have these pre-publication systems where we submit our protocols, and that's also a way, so we are now having this best practice in place to avoid this type of bias. Yeah. So this is improving very much, including also, maybe we're a bit late, we as agricultural economists, but this is improving, yeah.
Do you have any other questions? Or maybe we can go to the remote one, because we have quite a lot.
Yes, we have two very short questions about the methods. The first one by Mikkel Milevic, who asks, because it is inspired from the medical field, when you implement RCT in the field of agriculture, do you use a single-blinded or double-blinded protocol? And the second question is from Robert Finger, who asks, do you provide the true information when you talk about the nudge, about the competitive neighbors?
So to Robert Finger, yes, we did provide the true information. We have ethical, but you know that, Robert, we have ethical guides, and we are not supposed to manipulate our subjects, be they students or farmers or anything else. So there was another study that we did, and it was also a social norm comparison, and we had to try hard to make sure that we were not saying something that was dishonest with subjects. On the first question, yeah, it wasn't a double-blind protocol. I guess it's a bit different here. Mind you, yeah, well, it wasn't. For lots of reasons, it wasn't. But the idea of a double-blind protocol is even the experimenter doesn't know who belongs to the treatment group and who belongs to the control group. So that the experimenter himself doesn't pollute, contaminate the experiment by his implicit or even, not even willingly, but his type of behavior. So, no, that wasn't the case.
Some question about the cap, how cap how is it consistent with the cap? So there is one question from Henriette again, I guess, about at what level does nudging in farming work best? Is it mean local, regional, national? Do you have any clue on that?
At what level does nudging works best?
Works better. Do you have any idea on that?
Well, I mean, there is a very wide range of nudges. So this really depends on what you want to try to achieve with nudges.
And she told us that Pan-Europe with IBMA, with IUBC, they have made a kind of mapping at EU level. So maybe we can have a look on that and mapping about this issue of at what levels should those kind of incentives be implemented.
Okay, that's the GRC work. Yeah. It's a vast... nudges... Okay, I'll say this differently. There are different types of nudges, and there is a paper in INRAE again which also discusses the behavioral biases and how nudges can address some of them and not all of them. So really it's something I would like to say it depends, really. But something that I have found is we all got very excited with nudges because it's cheap to implement most of the time. And so it's a bit different, so I guess we are excited. But from what I know of the studies that have been conducted so far is that nudges have a very small effect. So in terms of cost benefit, it might still be benefit cost ratio, it might still be a valuable approach, but the effect is often very small and very hard to detect. And Paul Ferraro can mention this as well. So it's probably not the solution to all our problems.
Okay, last question about the cap. Can the new delivery model is okay with EU principles of common market?
Well, that's something a bit different from, so, well, I don't know, but the European Commission decided, yes, that
okay,
it was compatible.
That's a good answer. So thank you very much, Sophie. I think we use our time. Our next speaker is Hugh Sharma Waddington. So the floor is yours, Hugh. He's from London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine in the United Kingdom, in London.
Great, thanks very much, Florence, and also Julie for inviting me to come. So what I'm going to talk about today is farmer field schools, which are an approach that have been scaled up worldwide in over 90 countries to over 10 million farmers at the latest count, to promote better pesticide management policies. I think it's probably fair that since I'm having to listen to you, I am listening and I said that wrong. I think it's probably fair that given you're having to speak English to me, I should probably say at least something in French for the next day. So these are also called, farm field schools, they're also called Champs Écoles des Producteurs and sometimes Champs Écoles Paysannes. That's the extent of my French for the next day and a half. So I led a team that produced a systematic review based on this approach. I've lost my pointer. Sorry, I don't have enough hands really to manage all of this. So anyway, and it's worth noting that we did this global review of implementation of farmer field schools in lower middle income countries. So we're really talking in my session about what can we learn from the global south for implementation in France or in Europe, perhaps particularly amongst poor farmers, those smallholders. Okay, so what is a farmer field school? So the Farmer Field School was developed by the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, the FAO, and it was developed as a consequence of the 1960s and 70s Green Revolution policies, which were very successful in getting farmers to adopt so-called modern growing practices like pesticides. In fact, they were so successful that there's been a problem of overuse of pesticides, which I think everybody here will know something about. There's also a problem in the fact that it's quite hard to reach the poorest farmers, so there were a lot of farmers that were being left behind. So the FAO developed an approach to promote integrated pest management, which was an attempt to control the harmful overuse of pesticides and empower farmers, including disadvantaged farmers, to use their knowledge to experiment and to use better pest practices. So there were some more easy messages that were being communicated, like don't spray pesticides within the first 30 days of the cropping season, but then there were more common practices around what are beneficial pests versus what are harmful pests. And so there was quite a suite of information that was being communicated about in integrated pest management. And the idea is that it's a bottom-up approach in which farmers from a community will be selected and they will attend every week, preferably, a facilitated training where they will learn the approach to integrated pest management, but they will also be empowered to kind of experiment and be able to be better able to cope with the problems that they might affect them later on. So it's an explicit shift away from a more chalk and talk style of agricultural extension, top down, to a more bottom-up approach, or at least that was the intention by the FAO. Okay. There was quite an acrimonious policy debate which inspired our review. So our review was done, although we did work with the FAO and we did work with the World Bank, our review was done independently, and perhaps this is one of the benefits of doing a systematic review. And there was Inès and Benoît talked about, there were some questions earlier about, who is the judge and jury for, who can say what evidence is credible and what's not. So there is a role, I would argue, for systematic reviews in that process. So on the one hand, there's a World Bank study from 2004, which basically said that of the Indonesian IPM, nationwide IPM Farmer Field Schools program, there were no significant impacts on the performance of graduates, and there was no diffusion to neighbours. So there was also no significant impacts for Farmer Field School neighbours. That's people that lived in the Farmer Field School villages, but which didn't attend. Okay, so that's single study evidence, albeit it's of a nationwide program. Then there was a literature review that was published a few years later by the FAO, which came to a rather different conclusion. The FAO said results demonstrated remarkable, widespread, and lasting developmental impacts. So you might wonder what could explain the difference between these two very different takes on it. And this is the kind of field that we came into with our systematic review to try to see what did a systematic review of the evidence actually say. So I wanted to bring in a bit of participation, and I'm told Miriam said that she would be Miriam's going to enable some participation online as well. So what I want you to do is, usually I'd get you to stand up and walk around the room, but I don't think we've got time for that. I'm going to give you 3 statements, and I want you to just raise your hand if you ask you if you agree or if you disagree, and if perhaps we'll get to if you're not sure. Okay, so the first question is, I have heard of systematic reviews. Please raise your hand if you agree. Not bad, okay, that's nearly half, okay. Online, have we, oh, right, so we'll get to online. Anyone hasn't heard of systematic reviews? Don't be shy. I hadn't heard of them 10 years ago either. Oh, a bit more than 10 years ago, but yes. So a few people, is anyone just not sure? Okay. Okay, online, do we have any? Okay, so I'm going to ask the next question. Sorry for those of you online. I think we probably don't have time to enable your participation. Maybe we can get you to participate in a later question. Second of all, I have done a systematic review. Has anyone done? Yay, right. There's 5 of us in the room that have gone through the heartache of doing a systematic review. I shouldn't say that. It's a very enjoyable process. Okay. And thirdly, I use systematic reviews in decision making. So whether you're taking decisions about research, about maybe conducting a randomized trial and you want an effect size, or you work in policy, please put your hand up if you've used a systematic review ever. Yes, 1.5. 1.5 of you. Okay, good. Thank you. Thanks for that. Okay. So what is it? It's a rigorous process to take all of the existing high-quality evidence. That includes both the published and the unpublished evidence. It's really important. Both Julie and Sophie have talked about publication bias, so we know that there's an issue, and we try to address it in a systematic review from the outset by incorporating unpublished studies published in working papers, and so on. And we collect all of that high-quality evidence. We critically appraise it to say whether that evidence is rigorous enough to answer a policy question. And then we take all of the findings together, and sometimes we use a method called meta-analysis, but it depends on whether we're of the type of evidence that we're synthesizing. But we try to say what evidence is generalizable and what evidence is context-specific. So there's a history, it's been around for 50 years or so, and it is the standard approach used in medicine, at least in the UK, and these are some of the organizations that I work with that have, that promote systematic reviews. So it's not a literature review. It's primarily there to answer a policy question. So, or a question for policy and practice. And the approach is generally, as it would be with a primary study, and the closest thing to a systematic review is actually a primary study rather than a literature review. Okay, so because of the checks that need to go in, the fact that you're working in a team, it's much more like doing a primary study, but you're doing it, you don't go to the field in order to do it, or you don't need to go to the field in order to do it. So we develop review questions that are answerable, we understand an intervention theory of change, we collect all of the studies, including published and unpublished studies, we assess the biases in the evidence base, and then we synthesize the evidence. So this is what we did for the farmer field schools, and again, like Sophie, I'm going to be talking about what I know best, which is a study that I led. It is based on around 500 studies that underlie it, and we tried to show in this review that you can answer a wide range of policy questions, not just questions about effectiveness, but you can answer questions about implementation, about scale and sustainability and targeting. So I probably won't have time to get to all of those answers, wrong computer. Okay, so we systematic portfolio review of projects. What did we find? That essentially, and bearing in mind that there are farmer field schools which have been done in high-income country contexts. There are farmer field schools in Europe, probably even in France, but we focused on the programs that have been implemented in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And what we found was that the first approaches were developed in the late 1980s. And as I mentioned at the beginning, over 90 countries and over 10 million farmers worldwide. So it's an important global movement. The approach is used in different ways. So it's important to note that there are the FAO would promote a much more bottom-up approach and would argue that if it isn't bottom-up, then it isn't a farmer field school. But there are others that have used more top-down approaches. Usually, though, a farmer field school, however it's done, aims to communicate some information about about pest management, whether it's integrated pest management or some other approach. This is the theory of change. I'm showing you this because what I'm going to do is present a meta-analysis of outcomes along this causal pathway. So the idea, yes, I've got the clicker, okay. So there is quite the intervention itself is quite complex, and I probably don't have time to really talk about that intervention, but there are components of an inception phase where, since it's a facilitated approach, that means that you need to train and recruit facilitators. So that's people that can actually facilitate rather than talk at other people. Then there's an approach to targeting, to recruiting and enrolling farmers and keeping them in the program throughout the growing season. Then there's the training itself, and then the intermediate outcomes relating to knowledge, and then behavior change, so better use of practices like integrated pest management, less use of harmful pesticides, and finally the impacts on yields, income, health, environment, and there are empowerment as well as one of the objectives. The other component, particularly important for integrated pest management, is the dissemination to farmer neighbours. So in other words, not all farmers in a community can attend a field school. So the idea is that those people that do attend will be selected in such a way that they can then disseminate the information about the integrated pest management to neighbour farmers. And so there'll be some diffusion to neighbours and then eventually some sustainability. And it's important for integrated pest management because if it's not adopted at a community level, it's not a sustainable approach. So this is a summary view of the 90 studies that findings that we meta-analysed. And we broke up the outcomes into the knowledge outcomes, the behaviour outcomes, and the agriculture outcomes, and then the environmental and other outcomes. This just shows, this is just a bar chart which shows the average effect for each outcome across studies and the 95% confidence interval. And so what you can see is that essentially all of these effects, when we look across individual studies, frequently wouldn't be statistically powered to demonstrate an effect. But when we use meta-analysis to increase the statistical power of our test, what we find is that we're seeing significant and quite large effects in these pilot programs. So this is an example of a meta-analysis which underlies each one of those effects I showed you has an underlying meta-analysis. So this is the meta-analysis for knowledge. And essentially, every single one of these studies represents an experimental study. Then none of them are true randomized experiments, but they are quasi-experiments. Every single one of them shows an effect of the farmer field scores on knowledge as compared to the control group, which didn't attend which was from another village that didn't receive the field school. But it also shows what the impact on knowledge was for neighbors that were supposed to benefit through dissemination. And what we see for knowledge is that there's a big impact on, like farmers, they do learn about integrated pest management, they know about when they're supposed to spray their pesticides, but there's no impact for the neighboring farmers, which you can see. So this vertical line is basically the null effect. What happens when we looked at adoption of technology? So it was the same finding. There were large reductions in adoption for field school farmers, but no effects for neighbouring farmers that weren't able to attend the field schools. Similarly, for these pilot programs at least, there were big impacts. So they don't look like very big effects. I think that the yields represents a 13% increase, and the revenues represents around about a 20% increase. That doesn't, if we were just to look at effect size, comparing effect sizes, that probably isn't a very big effect. For a farmer, that's quite a big effect, a 20% increase in income. I think we'd all be happy with a 20% increase in our incomes, right? So these programs are effective. And when the programs involved some upstream and downstream co-interventions, so some support for purchasing input and some marketing, there were effects as big as 150% increases, so massive, massive impacts. But no evidence of diffusion. So essentially, when we looked across all of the studies, there simply wasn't the impacts on the neighbouring farmers in the farmer field school villages. So diffusion just wasn't spontaneous, and when the field school approaches tried to incorporate some approach to diffusion, like a field day or so like a farmer field day, for example, getting the villagers to come and see the farmer field school's plots, there still didn't seem to be this spontaneous diffusion. So what we also did, and I'm not presenting the qualitative findings for the other outcomes, but we looked at the qualitative evidence. So of our farmer field schools review of, there's 90 or so impact evaluations using quasi-experimental approaches. There's around 50 studies that used qualitative approaches, so case studies and we didn't include anthropological evidence, although we could have done that, but anyway. And what that suggested was that basically the message about integrated pest management was it needed to be learned in an experience-based way. You had to learn it through experimenting and attending the field schools. It just wasn't something which could be spontaneously diffused. And there was a large component about actually learning techniques which had been lost since the Green Revolution, which required this participatory schooling approach. And there were other issues that, like, for example, around whether farmers were, the social cohesion angle, whether farmers were competing with one another. If farmers were competing, they may not want to share information about improved techniques. And ultimately, we felt from reviewing the evidence that the approaches were scaled up too rapidly, and that a better approach, a more effective approach, would be to reach more farmers, to go for depth of coverage in an individual village over breadth of coverage at the nationwide level. So in other words, in order to reach critical mass, in order to get that sustainable adoption of technologies and sustainability of the impacts. How long have I got? 5 minutes, something like that? A bit more? Yeah. Okay. So. This is another meta-analysis slide. What this shows is, and I'm sorry if you can't, if the text is a bit too small. What this shows is the difference between when we looked at the impacts on yields of individual studies, what happened in the yields for the pilot projects versus the nationally scaled up projects. And you can see this. Again, you see this big difference that in the pilot programs that were done at a smaller scale, and this is similar. Also, Sophie made the same point in her previous presentation. We're seeing quite substantial effects. When it goes nationwide, there are problems, and at least there's only, as far as I'm aware, there's only 2 nationally scaled up programs which have been evaluated, but both of them showed. The evaluations of those programs showed no improvements. Okay, so I think I'll try to rush through the next slide. There was some. It's the big issue in low-income contexts is trying to target the poorest farmers in low and middle-income countries. That's a lot of women. There's around 50% of farmers are women in low and middle-income contexts, and so field schools explicitly tried to target women, and around a third of the projects were successfully targeted women. But there were problems in the targeting process, and how the targeting process and how the targeting mechanisms worked could actually discriminate or acted to prevent women from taking part in the program. So, for example, the targeted farmers, they might need to have land, they might need to own land, they might need to be educated, they might need to be members of farmer groups, and there were examples where those targeting criteria were applied and which excluded women. And there were particular cases where the learning was that if you want to successfully target disadvantaged people, you need to proactively go in and recruit them and not leave it to the community to do that. This funnel of attrition, this is very similar. I can't remember Sophie's, the word she used. This funnel of attrition tries to explain how it is that when we start with a potential pool of participants, what happens all along the way, which causes the effect, which causes the numbers of people to be to know about the program, then to participate, to continue to participate completely through the program and become a graduate, then to adopt the practices after the field school, to transmit that message to the neighboring farmers. Essentially, every step of the way, there can be a problem, and you would expect to see a smaller effect. And I think that's quite consistent with what others have said today. Okay, so what did we conclude for policy? That farm field schools are effective in pilot projects. Now, there's some issues about the quality of the evidence, which I'll talk about possibly in the next couple of slides. But essentially, in these pilot programs, farmer field schools appeared to be effective, but they didn't appear to be effective in promoting dissemination of information. So in other words, if you wanted people to learn about integrated pest management, they needed to attend a farmer field school. At the same time, we didn't think that the farmer field schools approach alone would be possible to solve past the problems of achieving scale in agricultural extension. So there's the evidence that it's not effective in scaled-up programs. The key issue seemed to be that there were problems in recruiting and training people that could facilitate a farmer field school. So people that being able to facilitate is actually a skill. It's something that you need to learn. It's quite a hard thing to do, and not everybody can do it, or at least people need to recognize it as a skill that needs to be developed. And I'm sure that, I know that there are presentations from Alain and others talking about what kinds of price distortions there are, and what were the issues that the farmer field schools were going up against, these massive pesticide subsidies and extensionists who earned commission when they sold pesticides. So there were issues there. Okay. So what about for research? So, this is a program of research which I understand is new and it's exciting. So what could be learnt for your program about our experience of doing that? So first of all, there need to be more, at least for farmer field schools, we didn't identify any randomized trials. Now, randomized trials, they have they're suitable to answer certain types of questions, maybe not best placed to answer other types of questions, but they are an important part of the evidence base. And it is perfectly possible to do a randomized control trial of a farmer field schools program. So I'm only aware of one or two which have been done since we did this review. But those studies need to incorporate data on implementation. Since it's so important for the intervention theory of change in how it's conducted, that means also collecting qualitative evidence, mixed methods evidence, other types of evidence that indicate how the program was implemented, and also actually speaking to farmers and facilitators and extension workers about some of the challenges they faced. What can we learn for evidence synthesis? Well, we did this study, although it was published more recently, the searches were completed in 2012, so a review update would be quite timely now, and that review update, given that farmer field schools are being also rolled out in high-income contexts, could incorporate high-income countries' context to see what the evidence base there says. There are few systematic reviews on this topic. There's tons of agricultural literature out there, RCTs, quasi-experiments, more modeling studies, qualitative evidence out there that we can draw on to answer questions around, maybe about different approaches to promote IPM or other pesticide policies. And a good way to start would be by doing a map. So I don't know if an evidence map where you show what evidence is out there for particular interventions to tackle pesticides and what outcomes are available. And there's a whole an exciting new field in evidence synthesis which is around mapping. So that's the end of my presentation. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Questions in the room? Christian?
Thank you, Hugh, for your presentation. Education policy is one of the regalian policies of every country in the world. And there are many, in agriculture, there are many vocational schools all over the world. What are the lessons from your research on what we could tell all the countries regarding the content of the training in the vocational schools?
Okay, so I will try to answer that question as best I can. So a farmer field school is essentially a vocational, in the field, adult education program. And it draws on good principles of adult education, which is about discovery learning, using what I think is called a social, it's a pedagogy which is a social constructivist, I think it's called. So what can be learned from our review about that approach? I think first of all, if the approach theory of change says that it needs to be bottom-up and participatory, then it needs to be implemented in such a way, which means that the implementation that actually happens in the field schools, there needs to be some not just monitoring of whether it's being implemented as it is supposed to be, but also that there's sufficient support and backstopping for people that are leading the facilitation approach, because it isn't supposed to be chalk and talk, it is supposed to be an empowering, bottom-up, facilitated intervention, as I said. Secondly, I suppose on the targeting, so how our all programs are targeted in some way. We don't usually have enough resources to make sure that everybody, if it's a training program, that everybody can attend. So there's ways in which the targeting criteria and the mechanisms used to targeting actually are consistent with what the objectives are for our program. So if our program aims to empower women, for example, then we need to use a targeting approach which actually is conducive and relevant for women farmers. So very simple example, if given that most, I mentioned 50% of farmers in low-income contexts are women, they largely grow food crops. So, but if your field school is targeting crops for sale, then you're not going to attract very many women to your field school. So there's kind of maybe that's too simplistic for the European context. I don't know, but and I suppose the third lesson would be about how to take it to scale and what the critical mass is needed in a particular place to ensure that there is, where we're intervening, there's a critical mass of people that are adopting so that we actually get sustained adoption and impacts, and perhaps not going to scale too soon with an approach where we need to get that critical mass early on.
Thanks for your presentation. So what I found very interesting is this aspect that you said when the change was not accompanied by a change in the value chain, upstream or downstream, then it was not so durable and not so intensive. So for the case studies I'm going to present, that was the same that we are also saying in Europe. So I was interested, I think that's something that's very important if you want to change practices. And I was wondering if you could go more into detail. Is that possible? Do you have something in mind, examples where this was actually successful in the case of your...
Do you mean in terms of diffusion of knowledge?
In terms of accompanying the change in the value chain, upstream or downstream, what were kind of examples how this was put into place?
Oh, okay, I see. Yeah, I think they were quite simple. So a lot of the time, impact evaluations will look at a simple intervention like implementing a farmer field school, but that will be abstracted from, well, what would happen if we actually made it a complex intervention by adding input subsidies or providing support to get crops to market and that kind of thing. So there weren't very many studies that did that. There were, in fact, in our review, there were only 4 impact evaluations, none of which were randomized evaluations. They were four quasi-experiments, which incorporated both, and I think I remember one of them was in Ecuador. So it was a case where it was for coffee. It was for obviously it was for a crop for market. It was coffee, and they provided some input support. For example, I think that in that case there were women involved, so they provided appropriate inputs that the women could use, for example. And then marketing support might be anything from helping with the storage to getting the transport to market and that kind of thing. So it's important to bear in mind that when we're doing these impact evaluations, that quite often the academic the question we're interested in as an academic, which is, does this specific thing work, may not be the relevant question for what the policymaker would be wanting to know, which is, well, what happens, when we combine it with these other approaches?
Maybe a quick follow-up then. Would it be more interesting to follow on to focus on recommendations than on effects sometimes in these kind of reviews? So not focusing on the result table, but focusing on the recommendations that come out of the study. So, do you mean, okay. I suppose so. I mean, yes, I suppose I'm showing you my working, because this is a room of researchers. If I were presenting to a policy audience, I wouldn't be. I might show you that overall, effects, but I wouldn't be showing you my working of the forest plots themselves. But I do think it's important that we recognise that this is serious research. This isn't what we're doing. Isn't just communicating findings. We're actually critically appraising the studies to the level beyond that which is expected of academic journals, and then we're pulling together the findings using statistical methods or advanced appropriate methods for qualitative research. So I suppose that's partly why I've shown you all the working. We're actually discouraged from. There's a difference between recommendations and implications. We're actually discouraged from making recommendations. Maybe that's because for systematic, you can do a systematic review, let's say, of all the farmer field schools in France. But we are, I suppose, the philosophical perspective where I'm coming from is that we can learn lessons from different contexts, and actually having that heterogeneity gives us more to play with statistically, and so we're discouraged from making recommendations of our findings to a particular context, to like policymakers in France to say you should do this, but we can make broader implications of what we're doing, which is what I've tried to show at the end.
Okay, thank you for the presentation. Alexandre Jacquet from the Center for Environmental Economics in Montpellier. If I got your content correctly, you said that you observed 2 scaling up of farmer field school and that they did not work. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Were they preceded by an RCT, those scaling up? And then did they keep the same budget for the farmer field school? And what was the control group? Because you can have a lot of contamination if it is a large scale experiment. Okay,
very, very good question. So the context is that these scale-ups were done before RCTs became a big thing in development in economics. So the first scale-up, the scale-up of the Indonesian IPM Farmer Field Schools program, that paper was published in 2004, and the scale-up of I think it's Cambodia or Vietnam, the other program, was done a few years after that. So this was before, I suppose, people did know in economics about the importance of doing experimental studies, but it hadn't really taken off in the way that nowadays we would expect that, where are all the RCTs? This is a program which is very amenable to randomization, so of course we should be doing RCTs. I mean, it's a bit of a no-brainer, but back then, the methods used were what we might call quasi-experimental approaches, both of which drew on, I think the Vietnam one drew on observational data. So there was an existing LSMS data set already. For Indonesia, they did collect their own data, but it was a difference in difference study. So there was a pre-test and a post-test. And what they did was, in order to get at this issue of contamination and spillover effects, they expressly chose control groups to be a certain distance away from the... so control farmers were from villages several kilometers away, and there were neighbor farmers chosen from the farmer field schools village, but they were chosen to show whether or not there was any diffusion of impacts. Okay?
Yes, thank you for this very interesting presentation. It's Sophie Thoyer here. Just a very quick, simple question. It seems an enormous amount of work. So how have you conducted it? With how many people? For how long? And just discovering that it was conducted in 2012, and then now we have to redo it again for the next period. It's a bit, yeah, it's a lot of work.
Yes, okay. Yes, it was a lot of work. I suppose as a group, we've been doing, once, you know, it's a bit like when you do your first trial, it's a lot of work. And you know, with practice comes, practice makes perfect, as they say. We were a team of 5 core members, and we had a couple of so that's a lead for the quantitative side, which is myself, a lead for the qualitative side, plus additional research fellows and a couple of research assistants. So there were about 7 of us. We did it it took around 2 years, but we were working on other stuff, so it wasn't like we were working on it full time. So I suppose the amount of time it took was probably similar to how long it would take to set up and run a field trial, for example. And the reason why it took that long is because we went very broad on the types of questions and the evidence. If we'd have just limited it to the question about effectiveness, we'd have, and let's say that we just wanted to focus on the most rigorous experiments and quasi-experiments, we would have done the review in less than 6 months, I think, or in around 6 months. But so it took long, and it was a big, 500 studies. Most reviews don't get to 500 studies, but that's because we wanted to show what it was possible to do with the systematic review method. But it doesn't have to be like this, and there's a growing field of systematic reviews certainly in development in the area where I know best, which is agriculture in developing contexts.
From people online, from Véronique de Croc, she asked, maybe the diffusion to neighbors is time dependent, requiring a long time, maybe a generation time to diffuse. And I can complete, maybe you have some suggestion about what policymakers should do. You're talking about the critical mass of people enrolled into field schools. Maybe we should put more money on the table to enroll more people.
That would be, I think, a very good suggestion. So what is the issue with policy? Obviously, we're working with finite resources. What's the issue with impact evaluations? We're working with finite time periods. There has to be, so one of the key conclusions would be put some policymakers that take decisions about funding research, put some money into long-term follow-ups. We know where the programs have been. It's not, it's just an additional survey round. Let's look at the long-term follow-ups. There's plenty of researchers that want to work on it, so that would be a good place to put the resources. And then I'd also say other people have been talking about modelling studies as well, and there's different types of evidence that can be used to answer questions about diffusion of technology and network analysis and so on.
Thanks for inviting me to this meeting. It's really nice to be here remotely with you. My name is Helena Hansson. I am a professor of agricultural and food economics at the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences. And my presentation today is entitled Obstacles for Agroecological Transition Among Farms. What can we learn from a study on business development in Swedish agriculture? So what I am going to present to you today is based on a paper that is a joint work with Japsuk from Wageningen University, and I think he is also one of the speakers in this meeting. The paper was published earlier this year in Journal of Rural Studies, and with the title Perceived Obstacles for Business Development, Construct Development and Impact of farmers' personal values and personality profiles in the Swedish agricultural context. So I'm going to present to you today this study and also draw some conclusions about how it might translate into other settings, and in particular in the uptake of agroecological practices. So about the background of the paper. We took the starting point in that the efficient policy design needs to build on an in-depth understanding about which factors farmers actually think prevent them from developing their business in the way they prefer. Much of policy is based on developing vivid, strong and resilient farms. And what are actually factors that farmers think prevents them from developing their business? And we focus on the way that the farmers prefer themselves. So not in any predetermined direction, but in the way they prefer, as that we think would link well to farmer viability and resilience. And we also took a starting point in literature on farmers' values. So for instance, those papers that you see here, which has shown that farmers are driven by a combination of pecuniary and non-pecuniary values. So not only the financial values, but also other values. And it is important to allow for a method to collect obstacles that allows farmers to actually aim to achieve also non-pecuniary values in their business. So finally, we took as a background that we thought it is important to understand obstacles perceived by farmers in developing their needs, and that we allow for these obstacles to allow for a range of pecuniary and non-pecuniary benefits to actually underlie these obstacles that farmers perceive. So the aim of this paper was to determine the empirical content and structure of perceived obstacles for business development, and also to explore how individual differences between farmers can function to determine these perceived obstacles. We used survey data from a sample of 382 Swedish farmers. We collected data from an online survey. We had a response rate of 18%, which is of course not a brilliant response rate, but on the other hand, it's quite similar to what we normally achieve now in surveys aimed at farmers. The survey the sample frame was drawn from a population of Swedish farmers, but those that are actually considered to be professional farmers, so not those that have their farming operations for, let's say, recreational purposes and so on. So, so these were not part of the sample frame. We put a limit at the estimated labor need of less than 400 hours per year were excluded from the sample frame. So these would be the small holdings in Sweden. And the survey focused, among other things, around the perceived obstacles for business development. First, we developed a hypothesized content for perceived obstacles for business development. We based that on previous literature, in particular Coleman's study from 2017, and also on interviews with actually 51 farmers in Sweden. And those interviews were, I mean, it sounds a bit too much to do 51 interviews for a background material for a survey, but these interviews were actually part of a report that was published by my university in 2018. And they were part of a governmental commission on the impact of the Swedish Land Acquisition Act in Swedish agriculture. But we could use content from these interviews to develop the hypothesis content of the perceived obstacle for business development. And we also complemented with discussions with the reference group. So we put quite some effort into drafting the content of the perceived obstacle construct. And we hypothesized the obstacles to focus around financial resources, competitors, business partners, current and prospective profitability in farm operations, access to knowledge and skills by the farmers, institutional settings, and geographical setting and farm layout. So, for instance, distance to the fields and number of fields, and so on. That's part of the layout variable. When it comes to individual differences, we went to the psychological literature and focused on personal values and personality. And personal values we identified from a typology that was developed by Schwartz originally in 1992 and then continued development by Schwartz, several decades after its first publication. This is a very well-known and well-established personal value scale. We used the short version of Schwartz personality scale, which was published in 2005. And for personality, we used the well-known Big Five personality inventory. And also here we used a short version to avoid overloading the farmers with too many questions. To estimate our model, we used a mimic model. And the reason is that we have both reflective indicators of our obstacles or of our perceived obstacle of business development, and we also have formative indicators. In particularly, we considered indicators related to profitability as reflective, and we considered the other indicators of obstacles as formative. And then we had the Z variables, which are the individual differences. Here are our results, and I realize that this might probably come through as super small on your end of the connection. So I'll try to explain what's in there. We have in the column to the left, first the personality and personal value variables. Then we have the formative indicators and the reflective indicators. So in the first model, we had the Z variables, which are the individual differences, and we had the reflective indicators of profitability concerns. For the second model, we added on the formative indicators. And for the third model, which is the model we use to interpret results, we had, in addition to the formative indicators, also interactions between the formative indicators. And I have on the next slide, which is easier for you to see, I've summarized results in a nutshell. So from our results, we can conclude that perceptions of obstacles for business development in this particular setting center in particularly around access to financial resources, around farm layout in terms of the physical layout and the farmyard and the fields. Geographical location is considered a obstacle for business development, and so is consumer demand, available resources, and options for farm succession. Consumer demand and available resources were the indicators that were, or the obstacles that were considered the most problematic, although all these obstacles are actually related to each other. And when it comes to the impact of individual differences on farmers' perceptions of perceived obstacles, we found that personality traits, extraversion and openness which are two sort of central parts of the Big Five personality inventory. Those were extra important and were actually those that turned out significant in our model. Interestingly, personal values did not at all turn out significantly, and I have some explanation for that, which I will come back to. But so far, it's also interesting to note that extraversion and openness to change are actually those variables or personality traits that are normally linked in the literature to entrepreneurial behavior. So it was interesting that those were also the personality traits that came through as significant in the model. Now, given our results and the approach that we took in this paper, what can we actually learn for the case of farmers' transition to agroecological production methods? Well, first of all, when I have been thinking about this, I think that perceived obstacles for transition could be an interesting focus. So first of all, what would be the empirical content and what would be the empirical structure of the obstacles? So in the paper I presented, we focused on business development in general, and it might actually be interesting to have a look more focused into obstacles for a transition. And in that type of study, I think it would also be important to acknowledge that farmers might not only be motivated by a range of different pecuniary values, but also by non-pecuniary benefits in farming. So that means going quite broad and focus not only on obstacles that are related to profitability concerns, but also other types of obstacles, which might, for instance, relate to how difficult it is to transition to agroecology, what it does to one's self-identity as a farmer, and so on. And also following what we've done, it might be interesting also to have a look into how perceived obstacles for transition to agroecological practices can be explained. In our paper, the paper by myself and Jaap Zoek, we focused on as I said, on the individual differences, so personal values and personality traits. And as you saw on the slide that summarized results, personal value seems not so much to impact perceived obstacles in our case. And I think one reason for that could be that the Swedish personality scale is quite broad and focuses on personal values people might hold in general. So a sort of recommendation for future research, if this would be something you pick up on in the FAST project, would be to focus the value scale more on values that relate to agriculture. So not to use such a general value scale that we used. That would also generate quite interesting comparisons where it would be possible to see if a more focused scale actually leads to significant impact of values, or if personal values are actually not significant in this case, and it more has to do with the personality. Finally, it would be interesting, I think, to have a look into how farmers can be segmented according to their perceived obstacles for transition. So what segments exist and how can they be approached? And how can policy function to enable transition within different segments with different perceived obstacles? And yeah, before ending my presentation, I wanted to show you this picture, which is a picture of a Swedish agricultural landscape in a way that it quite often looks like, with the livestock and some forestry and some fields. This is a photo taken in the best time of the year in Sweden, where animals have just come out grazing and the flowers have kind of come back after the long dark winter. So with that, I would like to thank you for your attention. And unfortunately, I cannot hear you, so I don't know how we can do with questions and comments and so on.
Can you hear us or not?
Yes, now I can hear you. Great.
Yes, okay. Online, could you give some examples of personal values focused on values in agriculture?
Yeah, so there has been some papers developed that focuses on values perceived in agriculture. So it could be, for instance, work already in the 1970s by Gazan could be used to develop these scales, but also work that I have been involved in about a decade ago about values in agriculture. And this type of literature is basically focused on the existence of 4 types of values. One is instrumental values, which relates to profitability, etc. One is expressive values, which relates to the ability to realize dreams, visions, and so on from an agricultural business. One is social values, which relates to values in farming, which are related to being part of a family context or a neighborhood context, and so on. And then finally, the intrinsic values, which relate to being a farmer for the sake of agriculture itself. So I think it would actually be worth going back to these older value typologies in agriculture and if one is interested in looking into how values affects farmers' behavior. My criticism towards the Schwartz value scale is that it is too general. It is developed to fit or to explain differences in value profiles across different cultures and so on. So it might not actually be that surprising that we don't get so much significant impact based on that value scale.
There is a question from the audience in the room. I hope you will.
Okay. Thank you, Helena, for your presentation. Very interesting. I'm Francesco Vanni from CREA in Italy. I was just wondering whether you could elaborate a little bit more the concept of transition in your study, whether, for example, you consider farms that are actually, let's say, starting the transition process compared to farmers that have already been involved in transition, as you consider, for example, the different value perception and also drivers, barriers from, let's say, input substitution model compared to more advanced farmers, let's say organic or so on, compared to conventional, in order to, and I think it would be interesting to address and see the differences amongst value perception on the different transition stage.
Yeah, thank you. That is a very relevant comment, and it would be super interesting to continue this type of work with that specific focus that you mentioned. So in the study that I presented, we focused on business development in general. We didn't have any transition in focus. So we asked farmers about the obstacles that they perceived in developing their business in the way that they wanted it to develop. So it was not, we did not focus in this paper on any particular transition, let's say from conventional agricultural production methods to agroecological production methods and so on. But I think that would be a super relevant and interesting continuation of this type of work. And also, as you mentioned, to separate between farmers that are more advanced when it comes to uptake of agroecological practices, like the organic ones, for instance.
Any other question?
No, nothing in the chat. Maybe we should stop here?
Depends. If you... Thank you. If there is no more question, sorry, there is a question on the chat. It is a question to the audience more than to the speaker. Sweden is among the greenest countries. How would it be elsewhere? If anybody has some answer to this question, how can the situation be different from a less green country? Because maybe there is some specificity due to the sensitivity of Swedish farmers for agroecology. I mean, it is the way I understand this question. Is it different? The results could be different, maybe probably in other countries where people are less sensitive to the environment. Maybe I'm not sure that anyone has an answer, but it is a nice question.
Yeah, so that was a really interesting question. It would be great for continued research.
Will apply to other countries. Your typology will probably apply to other contexts.
Yeah, it could be. It could be applied, especially the typology that we developed, and also the method that we developed to assess the perceived obstacles. That's something that can be applied in other settings as well, and that would be super interesting. And as I said, both kind of differences in cultural settings between different countries, but also differences in relation to what we study. So we studied business development, and without sort of specifying that we were interested in a more environmentally friendly business development and so on. But to target the typology in that way would be super interesting, I think.
Enough time, and we have a last question in the room. Last, I don't know, but a new one. Christian.
Thank you, Helena, for your presentation. Regarding what you suggest of the comparison between the countries, what we have in mind is not only because Sweden is green, it's a cultural issue. And what, according to you, are the differences regarding the cultural perception of pesticide and crop protection. What is the cultural issue behind that?
No, sorry. I mean that there might be differences in what type of obstacles farmers perceive in their business development. So let's say, for instance, in Sweden, and I don't know in comparison to other countries what it would be like, but one of the obstacles that we found was prospects for farm succession, which is considered really important in Swedish agriculture, that farmers can pass on their farms within the family, so to a child, for instance. But that might not be equally important in another cultural setting. But and also, if we zoom into pesticide-free agriculture, I think there might be obstacles related to, for instance, what happens with the self-image of a farmer or self-perception of a farmer if you cannot use certain production inputs, and the sensitivity to that impact on self-identity might vary across European countries. And I'm only speculating now. I'm not sure if farmers' self-identity would be affected by a transition to pesticide-free agriculture, but it might. For instance, Burton explained in early 2000 that farmers' self-identity is very much built up around having very fertile fields with high yields and so on. And we could imagine that fields could look a bit different if we transition to pesticide-free, and farmers need to adjust their self-identity as a farmer to this new situation. But as I said, I'm only speculating now, but I think those type of comparisons would be really interesting.
Okay, so thank you for all of you. So we're going to have lunch, I guess, all the people here and outside, and we have to meet again very precisely at 2:30. Okay, so we have time to discuss for those that are here after lunch. Any information about where is the lunch, Miriam? Is it at the same floor or what?
Yes, I think Corinne is waiting.
Okay. Okay. So for the people that are remote, good appetite, and see you at 2:30. Thanks a lot, Helena. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.